Good morning. Sorry for the slightly tardy start. Thank you for joining us for this morning's live broadcast of 10 minutes of Torah. And as Providence would have it, if there's a singular theme that emerges out of some of today's Torah readings, it's very apropos to the time that we're in right now, this social distancing slash quarantine state that we find ourselves in. And I say that in so much as the Torah portion of this week, as we've been discussing, which deals with biblical leprosy, was perhaps the first instance of quarantining, in so much as a person who had been diagnosed by a Kohen, by the priest, as having leprosy would then be quarantined for a minimum of 7 days. So we've been talking about the fact that biblical leprosy is not a medical condition per se, although it is a skin adhesion or discoloration. So to that extent, there's a physical manifestation of the disease. But then you wonder, why is it that the diagnosis is given by a Kohen, priest, and not a doctor who specializes in skin, as in a escaping me right now, but everybody knows what a skin doctor is. Starts with an E. Someone wants that, type it on the screen there. So the answer is because the diagnosis was not simply a matter of identifying the coloration or the discoloration and the adhesion or the lesion, because the ramifications of someone being diagnosed as a leper meant isolation, meant being quarantined, and in order for, and that's considered to be segregated from the community, is considered to be such a difficult and devastating thing that type of designation and diagnosis could only come from a Kohen, and that is because a Kohen is the embodiment of love towards his fellow Jew. Now, we've actually discussed yesterday that we all obviously must carry love and have love toward each other, but it's like for a Kohen in particular, this is something that he had to have a strong, palpable measure of love toward another. As the Kohanim are the conduits for blessing for the Jewish people, that blessing has to be a blessing that is driven by love and connection. So we know that a Kohen who has a very strong love and connectivity to the community will be the last person to declare somebody a leper, and then and thus causing this person to be ostracized or segregated and to have to go into quarantine. So, given that the diagnosis of biblical leprosy comes from a Kohen, which again points towards the spiritual origin of it, and as we discussed yesterday, that the particular sin that would cause leprosy to break out on a person's body is Lashon Hara, which means speaking slanderously and negatively about another. Now, there are different types of diagnosis when it comes to the leper, depending on which part of the body the lesion or discoloration appears. And so there's a separate level of diagnosis that was applied if the discoloration of the skin, if the white blotches or blotch or adhesion occurred on the head as opposed to the rest of the person's body. The fact that the Torah provides a different protocol of examination for an adhesion that appears on the head also points towards the fact that the origin, the spiritual origin of a lesion that appears on the head is different than that on the rest of the body. And that is that whereas a lesion that appears on the rest of the body is the result of engaging in Lashon Hara, which is speaking slanderously and negatively about another, the head lesion was a result of arrogance and pride, and that therefore warranted a different type of diagnosis and also a remedy. In other words, to speak negatively about another whilst being a very a very divisive thing to do, and that's why the person ends up themselves being segregated from the community. But conversation, talking about someone, is relatively superficial. But if a person is in a general state of arrogance, in which they are self-centered, other than other-centered, other being first and foremost God, and a sense of connection to community, then that's indicative of an even deeper penetration of the toxicity that results in leprosy. And so there's a different type of protocol and segregation. But the common denominator is, and as it relates to what we're going through right now, is that the purpose of the segregation, the purpose of the quarantine, was to be a time period of spiritual rehabilitation. So the person who ended up being a leper as a result of speaking negatively. So what's the result of talking about negatively about somebody else? So when you degrade somebody else, the result of that is that people will disassociate themselves from that person or look down on them. And so what the result of speaking Lashon Hara is to create a wedge between people, to create separation between people. Either people will completely distance themselves and disassociate themselves from the person who has been negatively disparaged, or if they don't completely cut off communication, but will certainly limit it, because nobody wants to be a friend or connected to somebody who's the subject of such negative talk as they have heard about from the person who spoke in Lashon Hara. The purpose then of the perpetrator, the one who has spoken negatively, going now into quarantine, is to fully embrace and feel the experience of being isolated, what it means to be isolated from the community, what it means to be segregated from the community through quarantine. Now, the purpose of that is not punitive, but rehabilitative. And that's why the quarantine period is not indefinite. It's 7 days or 14 days after which the person re-enters the rest of the community, with now a renewed sense and appreciation for being part of the community and the social fabric that goes with that, and realizing that as a member of a community we have a responsibility to tighten the webs of connection rather than to undo them. And now, having been segregated for a week from the rest of the community, presumably, and this he's checked up on by the Kohen, who comes to see how the healing of the lesion is developing, and the healing of the physical healing of the lesion would be indicative of the spiritual work that the person is doing in them now, first of all, holding themselves fully accountable for the negative effects of what they've done, sowing discord and disunity amongst the people, and again coming out on the other side with a renewed appreciation for community and the responsibility that we all have, as I said, to be partners in a community through strengthening. And that doesn't mean that we are supposed to turn a blind eye to negative behaviors or not correct things that need fixing, but that can be done in a positive way without making it personal. The idea of Lashon Hara is when a person is degraded personally. So, excuse me, as opposed to we're not suggesting that any type of human behavior should be condoned and embraced and accepted in the name of community, but rather the way to go about correcting it is like a medical professional, like a doctor who provides correction for a physical ailment, whether it's through a prescription of medication or through whatever protocol or surgery, whatever. A doctor doesn't make this personal and start degrading the individual, but rather is oriented towards the remedy. And that's why we need to approach negative things that happen around us, including the behaviors, which is to find a constructive way, or constructive criticism, a constructive way to remedy, rather than make it into a personal thing and a disparaging one. Okay. Oh, we have someone joining us from Indonesia, Rola Likajo. Good evening to you. Welcome. And we have Lynn Howe joining us as you do every morning. Good morning. And we have Marla. Okay, thank you all for sharing your good morning or good evening wishes with us. Okay, so that's the Chumash, the Torah portion for today. And of course, so the parallel to the time that we're in now is striking and obvious, and that is, as we've been talking about regularly, this period of social distancing and of being homebound, a veritable quarantining, ought to be, should be, must be a time period in which we are doing our own spiritual rehabbing, which we all have in the course of normal life struggled to have the time to even stop and contemplate, where am I at, where am I headed, what am I doing with my life, what are my goals, what are my objectives, am I realizing my full potential? And I'm not just talking about in the context of career, but in terms of my spiritual life, which segues now to the Tanya section of today. The chapters of Tanya right now are a program for cultivating the two primary emotional connections to God, which are love and awe or reverence and respect. And in today's Tanya, the author, the Alter Rebbe, starts to develop the concept and the ideas further, and talks about there's lower level respect and there's higher level awe and reverence for God. So lower level is something akin to what we spoke about yesterday, which is to contemplate the vastness of creation and to realize that it's all, God is vested in all of creation, to realize that everything that you see, everything that you see on the terrestrial plane, everything that you see when you look up in the sky, and as we discussed yesterday, the fact that the sun moves towards the west is indicative of it moving towards the Shekhinah, the divine presence. That is actually lower level, that evokes a lower level of respect for God, enough for us to be committed to act in accordance with God's will, because we are impressed, as it were, by His majesty, by His grandeur, and it's so when we have that awareness, we don't have to think about this all the time, but we have this awareness at least once a day. That's enough consciousness to keep us walking in the straight and narrow, if you will. But then he talks about a higher level of awe and respect for God, and that's more about appreciating the infinity of God Himself. A simple way to distinguish between the two is this: you can be in the presence. Imagine that you're in the presence of a powerful person, and then imagine you're in the presence of a holy person. When you're in the presence of a powerful person, you are impressed or maybe intimidated by their power. You feel humbled in the presence of their power, and you therefore, if you were given some instruction by them, you would execute it and you would carry it out, because again, you are impressed by their power, which is sort of imposed upon you. That is similar to looking at God's interaction with the universe and the way He interfaces with the universe. That's to be impressed upon by God's power. But then think about being in the presence of a holy person. When you're in the presence of a holy person, it's not about being intimidated or moved by their power, but it's more about simply being moved by who they are. So when you look at a holy person, a genuinely holy person, you simply see and witness holiness and something very pure. And what that does, and the effect of that on yourself, is that you start to ask yourself, well, if such holiness is possible, where am I? And what am I doing with my life? And so the Alter Rebbe says that the higher level of awe and reverence for God is one that evokes a sense of shame. Not shame in a negative sense of being ashamed of who I am, or feeling guilty, but shame in the sense of being really honest about, am I truly living up to my God-given potential? And that is the type of effect that a holy person has. And I had the great privilege to be in the presence of that type of holy person, who of course was the Rebbe. The Rebbe's, the most impressive thing about the Rebbe was not the power, was not his power. It was not an intimidating presence, but a holy one. And just to be in his presence made you feel very transparent. And just to be in his presence demanded of you this type of challenge to yourself. Am I pushing myself? Am I growing? Am I realizing my potential? Am I being as holy as I can be, at least on any given day or any given moment. So that's the difference between lower level reverence and higher level reverence, which is the subject of today's Tanya. And lastly, we have the mitzvah of today, which is a similar theme that we spoke about before in terms of a leper going into quarantine, and that is the law of the cities of refuge. And this was a law, a provision for somebody who had killed someone unintentionally, as we spoke about yesterday. And the killer, the unintentional killer, would go to a city of refuge and live out the rest of their days there. And we discussed this at great length yesterday, and you can go to yesterday's broadcast, by the way, and see it if you didn't, where we talk about the details of this at greater length and detail. What I want to just mention today, excuse me while I just grab a tissue here. So what I wanted to talk about today was this, that the Torah says that cities of refuge had to be established in the land of Israel upon its conquest. But historically, the first cities of refuge that were established were by Moses in Transjordan. So we know that 2.5 of the tribes of Israel chose to settle in Transjordan. The land was very fertile there. That's the tribes of Gad and Reuven and half the tribe of Manasseh. And Moses established 3 cities of refuge there. Of course, Moses himself was denied entry into the land of Israel for reasons we're not going to get into right now. So the Rebbe offers a very beautiful insight that is very relevant to today's Tanya teaching that we just shared about the impact of being in the presence of holiness. And that is this, that there is a discussion amongst the later Torah commentaries as to when Moses first designated the cities of refuge in Transjordan, did they actually acquire the legal status of cities of refuge or not? According to most, they did not, because the cities of refuge as a legal entity only kicked in once the conquest of Israel took place and the cities of refuge in the land of Israel proper were designated, and then that would have conferred legal status on the cities of refuge established by Moses in Transjordan. So here the Rebbe offers a very powerful takeaway, and that is that what emerges here is that even though Moses determined what the 3 cities of refuge in Transjordan were going to be and delineated them and designated them, they were not actually functional until after the conquest of Israel took place. So the Rebbe asks a simple question. Well, the 2.5 tribes that settled in Transjordan numbered many hundreds of thousands of people. The conquest didn't take place for a while, and so practically, what would have happened to someone from those tribes in Transjordan had they committed an unintended killing? Where would the perpetrator go? And the answer that Rebbe says is profound. The answer is that it didn't happen. It simply didn't happen. And that's why Moses' designation then was more for the future than for the present. And why did it not happen? It didn't happen because Moses was still present. Because Moses was still alive and he was still a presence in the lives of the people. And his presence was such, as we spoke about before, not a presence of power, but such a presence of holiness and such an impact of holiness on the people, that not only were people not capable morally of committing murder, which is of course intentional, but even to have killed somebody inadvertently was not even within the realm of possibility. So that points towards the impact of the presence of a truly holy leader. Just his physical presence in the world is already a bulwark, if you will, of protection towards negative human behavior to a certain level. That's the presence of holiness. That's how powerful it is, without being imposing, but just simply being present. So that is why the tzaddik, the leader, the caliber of Moses, and like the Rebbe, is such a central and important presence in the lives of the Jewish community, because by being cognizant of that presence, and by being connected to that, and it doesn't necessarily mean being in the physical presence of the person, but it can mean even the study of their teachings, the observation of their behavior, that in and of itself becomes a great source of spiritual fortitude, strength, and morality that helps us walk the tightrope of life in a way that gives us a greater strength of anchoredness and balance and connection. So thank you very much for joining us this morning. I see Rabbi Umaner from Massachusetts, who also does online broadcasts on Facebook, which you can check out. I'm not exactly sure which, but you can check out Rabbi Umaner, Uminer. Thank you for joining us, and thank you all for joining us today and this evening, for those of you who are in different time zones. And we look forward to seeing you all, God willing, same time, same place tomorrow morning. Make it a great day.